The third chapter that I'd like us to talk about today is the user-centred safe design approach to control. And this chapter had a fairly extensive technical panel and a very capable technical panel. And most of the people on the technical panel made a contribution to the chapter, but certainly there was three people who took the lead in the authoring, is my understanding. Tim Horbury from the Minerals Industry Safety and Health Centre at UQ, and Robin Burgess-Limerick, similarly from MISC, and Neil Story from Safe Work Australia. And they were supported by Matthew Thomas, Leo, Margaret Cook and Chad Pettit. But Robin Burgess-Limerick drew the short or the long straw, whichever one it is, I'm not sure. And Robin's going to give you an introduction to that chapter and what they covered. It's non-ergonomic. The bottom one goes forward.
goes down. Yeah, you'd think they might.
Oh, excuse me. The other thing I should actually mention is we'd like to acknowledge HAFISA, because they certainly were involved in the development of this chapter, and two workshops were conducted at the annual conferences for HAFISA. So we would very much like to acknowledge the link there. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you very much. So I'm not going to go through what the chapter talks about, really. I'm just going to show you a few pictures. I think we know sometimes it's obvious when something's not designed for the user. And if you come to tea at an ergonomist's house and you get that cup, that's sending you a message. Okay? It's a bit like the McDonald's school of seating. You know, sometimes things are deliberately uncomfortable. We don't want you to stay a long time. So it's about user-centred design. That's sort of where the chapter's going. Sometimes it's obvious when things are not designed for the user. Here's another example, I think. We'll take a little bit of time to look at it, and you can see, to me, this is equally obvious that this is not well designed with the user in mind. So this is a still taken out of a video when someone is getting out of a dozer cab and egressing. So you can see there have been attempts to provide an access system. These things that have been welded on, they're bits that you can access. That's a handle, a little laser pointer, I suppose. Oh, duh, look at that. Okay, so that's a handle. There's a handle. There's sort of a step here. So, of course, if somebody slips off and lands on their head doing that, then they just didn't take enough care, did they, Andrew? Okay. So particularly you can imagine that this is not always done in the light and in the dry. You know, this might be done at night when it's been raining and there's mud everywhere. So clearly to me this is a system where there hasn't been much thought about the user. So what can we do about that? Well, there have been lots of fixes to that. Okay, so now we have a system where the user can access and perhaps egress, although still coming down those quite steep stairs is not going to be that straightforward, or very straightforward if you come down on your head. But to me that's still not user-centred design. That's user afterthought design. Okay, oh, you mean we have to find a way that someone can safely get in and out of our piece of equipment. What would it look like, do you think, if you did take the user and have the user in mind right at the beginning of the design process? What can you conceive? How could you get someone on and off a dozer? Difficult. And I could, looking at it out from the outside, thinking, yeah, well, I see the problem, not sure I see the solution. But there was a group, an engineering company, designers, that had this problem, but their problem was that they couldn't just add a ladder onto the outside of the dozer, because this was a dozer that had to be operated in an underground environment, so there was no extra clearance. The dozer was basically going to take up the whole space envelope allowed, a bit like trains. Driving access system for trains have got the same problem. You can't add something on the outside because it's going to get knocked off. So what did they come up with? Okay, so there's an access system. When you look at it, say, yeah, that works. But the only way a designer can arrive at that solution is by having that user's requirement in mind right at the beginning of the design process. So to me, that's an example of what the chapter is about. It's about a process that takes into account the tasks that the user is going to need to do. And tasks comes up and again throughout the chapter. It's about users do tasks. When you buy a piece of equipment, you buy a whole set of tasks that a person is going to do with that equipment. and not just the operation of it, the maintenance of it, and if you're talking about a building, you're talking about the construction of it, might be the demolition of it. There are a whole set of tasks that are associated with that design, and that's the level at which the analysis has to be. So the chapter is about how that might happen, what role a safety professional might play in that, what has to happen at a workplace to promote that sort of activity. It might not be a plant, it might be a workstation, it might be manual task risk management. We say, we know we've got a problem here with the manual task, how can we redesign the situation? What role should the users play in that? And it's not just a matter of asking the users what they want. There's a very nice Henry Ford quote. You know, if I'd done what people had asked for, they would have asked me for a faster horse. So it's not necessarily as simple as just saying, what do the users want? So that's what the chapter's about. I'll leave it there for the moment, see if we've got any questions.
I didn't appropriately introduce Mike Edwards,
That's
but we've asked Mike if he would give a professional... Don't run away. If he would give a professional's perspective of the chapter. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Pam, and thank you very much, Robin, because I'm glad you've shown this slide, because this slide feeds exactly into what I was thinking about on the train when I was coming down here. But one of my jobs is to make sure that when we get to drinks, we're all awake. So I'm going to ask some questions. Please indulge me. How many people in the room, pop your hand up, are safety professionals and as acting safety professionals right at this point in time? Right? How many people are academics? How many people are regulators? How many people are accountants? How many people are senior managers? How many people, senior managers in an operational sense, who make decisions about approving things like that? How many people are engineers who actually have to put that stuff in place? The reason I ask is that when I read the chapter, it made absolute sense what was in the chapter. We're all true believers. Every person in this room, I'm sure, would look at that solution and say that's the best solution. But in my 30 odd years plus that I've been working in the profession, to get something like that past senior management, you might have some chance at your plant, but you try getting that past your senior manager in America when they don't want to spend any money in Australia. And so what I got out of this was that this is exactly on the money. And I think our challenge is, how do we get the regulators, the safety professionals, the safety organisations, the media, that was the other group I forgot to ask, how many media people are in the room? Because I actually think there's some key stakeholders that are not here that somehow, if we're going to get this right, we have to engage with those key stakeholders. Because company directors, how many of them have got any sorts of safety training or safety background? Not many, in my experience. How many senior managers in our courses for management, how many of them do anything about safe design or safety or anything like that? Because I think this is where the issues are. The engineers don't really understand it. In my experience, what I would see is not that. I probably would have seen 2 slides ago. And the engineers would have been really, really proud of what they'd done. Look at that welding, right? And I would have said to them, oh, they're really good. Did you do it to the Australian standard? And they just look at me. I go, did you check the guarding standard to see what you actually had to achieve? What were the distances you needed to put in place to ensure someone couldn't get caught in that machine? So here's where I think our challenge is. And if there's, for the safety professionals here, you know, the body of knowledge is a fantastic tome. But when we're referring and we're giving advice as safety professionals, do we refer to the relevant chapter when we give our advice? Do we refer to the Australian standard? Do we refer to what the regulations ask us to do? So I don't think we do that. And the problem is, somehow, we've all got to get together, and we have to actually tackle those accountants who are the ones that actually approve the expenditure, and we have to tackle the senior management and the boards to get them to understand that this actually saves money in the long run, but you might spend a bit at the start. So that was really where I was coming from. So when I read it, I reckon it's a great chapter. Everyone here, if you get to read it, you'll say, yep, all in agreement. Because we're the true believers. We're here. It's the non-believers.
What was the question? You had a question.
And my question to you is, did you guys take into account how do you engage with these non-stakeholders that aren't here, or these other stakeholders?
Now, I'm very glad you asked that question. Now, it wasn't set up. The example I'm most familiar with is the example of the earth moving equipment safety roundtable. Has anyone heard of that group? In the mining industry may have. Okay, the problem arose out of a issue that the mining industry had dealing with companies like people who make that sort of equipment. When even a company like even the size of BHP would go to CAT and say, the access systems on the haul trucks are really not good enough. And they'd say, yeah, you're not big enough. Nobody else has got your problem. So the mining industry's solution was that BHP, Rio Tinto, Anglo and Xstrata, as they were then, and a few others got together and as a group went to Peoria and walked into Caterpillar, but they didn't ask to meet with the engineers or the designers. The insight was that's not the people we need to talk to. People we need to talk to are the marketing people, because they're the ones who tell the designers and the engineers what to do. And so the insight was, we as a group, and of course Caterpillar sees that market share walk in the room, yes, okay, we are going to take notice. And so big changes have happened. The example I wanted that I can make concrete is another manufacturer, Sandvik, who make a lot of different equipment, drills, underground stuff. They adopted a process that the Immersed group put together, which was basically a task-based risk assessment process to improve design involving the users. The requirements go beyond the relevant ISO standards. So standards are important, but they don't necessarily guarantee that you've done the best job. It goes beyond that standard in the sense that it's not just saying that it's a good idea to involve the users. The mining companies are saying you need to involve the people who actually operate and maintain the equipment. And to Sandvik's credit, they've adopted that process. That's up on their website called Sandvik Make a Difference website, task-based risk assessment. I'll brought up some text here. So they're talking about an example of a design process that they went through, and they said as a joint over a week they had people from the mining company who were buying a piece of equipment, and this is in Austria, so they've taken people from the mining company to where the designers are building or designing the equipment in Austria and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the current design controls that are there, evaluate whether those are effective, what things can we suggest, and importantly, what administrative controls do we suggest, acknowledging that there will be some risks that we can't control through design yet. Okay, so just to answer your question, there is stuff happening. You've got but sometimes the people you need to talk to are not necessarily the obvious ones.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Mike. And I think both Robin and Mike have highlighted that this is perhaps one of the most challenging, but one of the most important chapters to implement. So thank you to both of you and to the other authors of the chapter.